Tempted and tried, whereof made to wander, why it should be thus all the day long, while there are others living about us, never molested, though in the wrong. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When death has come and taken our loved ones, it leaves our home so lonely and drear. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Faithful till death, said our loving Master, a few more days to labor and wait. Tolls of the road will then seem as nothing, as we swing through the beautiful gate. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when he comes from his home in the sky, then we shall meet him in that bright mansion. We'll understand it all by and by. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by.
Thank you for coming back tonight to worship God. That's why we're here, to worship, to praise God, and to fellowship with one another. It's good to see your face tonight. It's always good to come back and be a part of the church here at Southside, to be a part of the family of God here at Southside. And I hope that we will appreciate what we have here. We have a lot of quality in this congregation. The quantities, not here tonight. We have some that didn't make it back. We do have quality, and we're glad that you're here tonight. I checked with Marie earlier today, this afternoon, and Bill did have a rough start. He was trying to eat some chicken from Dairy Queen when I called, and hopefully he kept that down. I hadn't checked, but she said, as Randy said today, he is very, very, very weak right now and just really doesn't know what they're going to do. I told her, I said, if he gets much worse, take him to the hospital. I said, he won't want to go, but you take him anyway. And she said that she knew she would do that, and she takes real good care of him. He goes to the doctor early Tuesday morning. to get his blood count done again. And so she said that, they may give him more blood Tuesday. They don't know yet. And they said they would give him blood just as long as there was hope. And so we hope that, again, he gets built up so he can take his treatments again. But pray for Bill and pray for Marie. She's, really worries about him and is concerned about him as a daughter should be. I want us to think tonight as we continue our study on James. This is the 8th lesson. We'll have one more, I think, on the book of James. But we're going to talk tonight about patience and persevering even when things are bad. I appreciate Randy leading that old song, one of my favorite, Tempted and Tried, because it talks about the way life is. We look around and we wonder, life's not fair. And we see sinners seemingly going through life, not suffering anything, not things we are, and we see Christians that suffering everything. And again, tempted and tried. And we think about death. But then, as the song said, we'll understand it all by and by. And so we see tonight that these brethren are going through some things. And the question I want to begin with tonight is, have you ever had bad things happen to you, even at the hands of other Christians? Think about that. We all have bad things happen to us in life. It's just part of life. In fact, it's part of the punishment that we bear, the consequences that we bear of Adam and Eve's sin. We don't bear the guilt of their sin, but we bear the consequences. And we live in a world where there's sickness. We live in a world where there's meanness. We live in a world where there's people that lie, cheat, steal. We live in a world where people misuse one another, abuse one another. We live in that kind of world today. And sometimes, unfortunately, even in the church, sometimes bad things happen, even at the hands of other Christians. I wish it wasn't so, but it's a fact of life that we need to realize. And James 5 deals with a situation just like this. And James' solution is given twofold. Number one, the Lord will make things right, and those who are oppressed just need to be patient and endure. That's the deal. The Lord will make things right, but those who are oppressed need to be patient and endure. We're going to look at the first 11 verses of this chapter tonight. I want us to begin to look at the Christian oppressors. We'll talk more about the term Christian there, but let's look at the oppressors, if you will. In James 5 and verse 1, James writes, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming up on you." Let's stop there for a moment and think about what James is saying here. James is talking about this idea of come now, you rich. He's calling their attention. He's telling them now is the time that you're going to face the music, so to speak, for what you've been doing. It's a call. He's letting them know that they need to realize. He's calling their attention. Remember last week we studied from James, the 4th chapter, and he talked about those men that was going to go and buy and sell and get gain for a year. And remember, they got in trouble for it. And the Lord told them. But in verse 13, we have that same phrase, come now, calling their attention to something, calling them to recognize this is for you. This is something you need to pay attention with. Come now. And then he identifies, come now, you rich. You rich. I want you to think about that tonight. They were rich in monetary goods. How did they get their riches? We're going to see that tonight as well. And then, so we ask, were the oppressors that are identified as the rich, were they Christians or not? It's interesting to read several different people on this, and people are equally divided. But I like to look at it from this standpoint. We know that, number one, James is writing in a book to Christians. It's identified as he writes to Christians, and he mentions them. He's writing to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. We began our study some time ago, and we said that even though this may lend itself to a Jewish audience, it's also apparent that he's writing to a Gentile audience as well. And so we see this and we understand this. James does mention the rich in this book beginning. James chapter 1, he talks about the rich in verse 10 of the text. And he warns and gives the perspective of the rich and the poor. I tend to believe that he's talking to members of the body here. There are some that believe that he's talking to non-Christian Jews. And again, I have trouble with that from the standpoint, what good is it going to write to them about what they're doing if they're not addressed in the book and if they're not Christians? I think it very well may be and is possible that he's writing to Christians. Now, these people are going to be accused of a lot of things. And sometimes it's hard for us to imagine that a Christian can do such things. But you know what Christians are above anything else? You got any idea of what answer I'm looking for? They're human. They're human. And human people foul up, human people fall away, human people make mistakes. There have been cases where so-called Christian people have done horrific things and have not been Christ-like. Even in the church, we see it from time to time. We see husbands that become unfaithful in the church, sometimes elders, sometimes deacons, sometimes preachers. We see wives that become unfaithful in the Lord's church. We see others that have different things. I remember coming in a situation in the congregation I worked with where the father and the husband in a particular family was arrested for incest in that congregation where I worked. I don't know the outcome of that. It was presumed that he was guilty, and the evidence was there probably that he was guilty of that crime. Was it shocking? Yes, it was shocking in a way, but in a way it wasn't. Because I know the influence that the devil has on people. And whether or not they were Christians or not, really not the matter. I think they were. Because the evidence seems to be in the book that he's addressing the rich, that he addressed preference being given to the rich. And so if they are Christians, they're doing some things that are not right. Whether they're rich or they're, as Phil Wilkerson used to say at Crowley's Ridge College, Phil taught history there. He's now since passed away. But his favorite expression, a lot of times said, looking out the window, that's just how Phil was that's neither here nor there. And that's the way it is, whether they were Christians or not. I think they were, but they may have not been. But they had a dilemma, and the dilemma was this. Their dilemma was that their miseries are coming upon you. They had things that were going to happen to them. Your miseries, they're coming upon you. We see in the Old Testament a lot this type of formula. We see where the prophets would go, and they would tell the people, come now. They'd get their attention somehow. And then God would tell them, this is what's going to happen. We're going to see that in the sense of the book of Hosea. You can read in the book of Jeremiah. You can read in the book of Ezekiel. And it is filled with God's reminder that things are going to happen, and they're happening because of this. And so first of all, James warns these people for your miseries that are coming upon you. Well, what was and then you had this aspect that again they were the weeping and the howling because of that misery that was coming upon them. And so we see this, and we see the dilemma that's there. We see the dilemma that he's saying, look, you need to weep and you need to howl. I'm going to point that out too. It's in the outline. That this idea of howling carries with the idea of this burst, or weeping here, the word carries with the idea of this bursting out in tears. They were being oppressed. They were being oppressed. And then you had this idea that they just, and suddenly this burst out of tears. I mean, they weren't, the rich were being oppressors, and suddenly they were just burst out in tears. The howling you can imagine, like the howling of a dog. Have you ever heard anyone cry like they were howling? Such pain and emotion, and just an emotional state had come over them. And they're crying and they're weeping. And the reason was their miseries. They're coming upon you. That's their dilemma they're facing. They're facing the result of their deeds and their actions that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But we ask, what is the cause of their misery? What caused them to be miserable? Well, look at verse 2. Number 1, your riches are corrupted. Now think about that. I don't guess they used paper money back there. They might have. They probably used silver and gold and other things. But let's suppose that you had $1 million. That's a lot of money, isn't it? I'd take it. Even in today's economy, I'd take it. I think I could live the rest of my life on that. Somehow. Let's say you got $1 million. And you go wherever, keep your $1 million under the mattress, buried in the backyard, or wherever, and you go and you look at that $1 million and it's suddenly unusable. Something happened to it. It's unusable. Well, that's what happened to this people's riches. It's corrupted. In their clothes, probably if they're rich, they're doing what? Well, if you read chapter 2, James talks about, having the rich come into your assembly and dressed in their fine clothes and everything, and basically you give them the back pew or the front pew, whatever, give them the best place to sit. And you take the man that's in lowly dress and you let him be your footstool. So they probably had really nice clothes, but he's telling them, your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded. And their corrosion will be a witness against you. Brother V.P. Black, a gospel preacher from years gone by that I had the privilege of hearing several times, that preached more on money than probably any other preacher in the brotherhood, and preached on giving. He was known for that. Wrote a book rushed for a witness, and he probably got it out of this text. The idea that their silver and gold were corroded, and, well, they didn't use it. They didn't use it to help others. They didn't give it to the Lord. They had it and they hoarded it. It'll be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. It's just going to consume you. That's what happened to your riches. And then you have heaped up treasure in the last days. Here they've got all this money. Part of it's corrupted. Their nice garments are being moth-eaten. Their gold and silver are corroded. That corrosion is a witness against them. That's eating them up. And then you have heaped up treasure in the last days. Well, let's look at a verse that talks about treasure and where it needs to be. The Lord in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew the 6th chapter taught these words. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. These people were laying up treasures on earth. And remember what we read earlier? The due date was coming, and they weren't ready. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. They're going to be like the king of old. In the book of Daniel, the king of Babylon, I believe it was Belshazzar, you're weighed in the balances and found wanting. And so we see the cause of their misery. Well, what did the rich do to bring on their miseries? Think about what the rich did. Well, we see first of all that the rich did defrauding of people. He said, indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud. Have you ever worked for somebody and then they said, well, I don't have money to pay you for it? Gets in trouble that way. Your pocket goes empty. And you're faced with the dilemma of what you do. And sometimes maybe something happens where they can't pay you. Then you might make arrangements. But maybe they just don't intend to pay you and never have intended to pay you. That's what these people did. You come over and mow my field, and when you're done, I'll pay you. But in the back of their minds, they had no intention of paying you whatsoever. Not that they didn't have the money, they didn't want to let go of the money. And it says that these are crying out, and the cries of the reapers have reached where? The ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. He's heard these oppressed people. And then verse 5. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with living in pleasure. And all of us live in luxury when we compare ourselves to most people of the world. And if you've ever traveled outside the country and seen how some people live in this world, I mean, if you go to a resort, maybe that's one thing, but getting to the resort, you probably saw some people that didn't live very well. But these people were living and they were keeping what they had. That's what it made it wrong. You have fat in your hearts, as in the day of the slaughter. Kind of go back to the man in the book of Luke that, he had such a good harvest, he had to tear down his barns, and he said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear down my old barns and I'm going to build new barns, and I'm going to say to self, you done well, just eat, drink, and be merry. We know what happened to him. These people are going to face the same dilemma. Why? Look at verse 6. You have condemned, and you have murdered the just, and he does not resist you. That's why it's hard for some people to believe, well, surely these are not Christians. That they have oppressed the innocent and even put to death those who did not resist them, even if their life was fixing to end. Well, that's verses 1 through 6. So we look at the rest of our text tonight. We look at the rest of our text and we note, what do the oppressed do? When people misuse us, when we face the misuse of others, whoever it is, what do we do? When we're oppressed by whatever oppresses us, what do we do? And folks, if we probably don't have it as bad as these people do we? If it'll work for them, it's going to work for us. Listen to what he says. First of all, he says, be patient until the coming of the Lord, like the farmer, by establishing your heart. Verse 7, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Wait on the Lord to come. The Lord's going to take care of things. If you look at the history of God's people in the Bible, you'll see where they had to wait on the Lord a lot during hard times. The cries of the people of Egypt when they were in slavery, when a Pharaoh was raised up that knew not Joseph. Those prayers went before God in heaven, and he called a man named Moses, and he told Moses, you go and you free my people. You had the various ones that were in captivity at one time or another, and they wondered, when is the Lord going to come? And he would send the prophets and say, you're going to be led. You're going to be brought out. Even when they were in captivity because of their sin, there were still some wondering, when are we going to ever go home again? We get to the book of Revelation, we see where those people under probably the reign of Domitian were wondering, how long are we going to have to undergo these things? We hear the souls that were beheaded under the throne of God saying, how long is it going to go on before our blood's avenged? Well, the answer is the same. Be patient. Wait. Wait until the coming of the Lord. Sometimes, we want to get even with people that mistreat us. And that's really not the right thing to do. Sometimes we can't get even. Sometimes we're oppressed in such a way to where we have no recourse. But you know what? One day, there's someone coming that's going to make things right. And that's the Lord. And then he gives the illustration. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. I had the opportunity when I both lived up in Iowa. The last summer I was up there when a student at Crowley's Ridge, or the student at Red Hardeman, to be around a group of farmers. That's the little congregation that I preached for. That's just about all that was there, was farmers. I learned something about farming. I drove a tractor for the first time, and I think the last time I ever drove a tractor. I got to know hogs really well. I lived next to a hog pen, and I went out and I worked with the guy that had hogs. I can tell you a little bit of hogs, besides they stink. But those farmers, they just had to deal with what came their way. I lived 12 years with farmers, a lot of farmers around that went to church at Corning. Wasn't as many as in the past years, but there was a couple that were big farmers. I learned something about farming from them. One of the elders would come by and get me, and he'd say, let's go out and let's go pick corn. So I rode with him on his combine one day. And I learned about picking corn. Interesting. I mean, that corn picker go down through there and the ears go out with all the kernels off of about the back. And the corn goes over in the little thing they're pulling there. I learned something about farmers there. And that's the standpoint is, farming is not an easy thing. We need to thank God for the farmers that bring us the food that we have. But the farmer that makes it in life, he knows the game. He waits for the precious fruit of the earth. He doesn't get paid until harvest. They'll give him a loan to make a crop, called a crop loan. And that crop loan at the end of the harvest has to be paid back. But what do? They wait patiently for it until he receives the early and the latter rain. Farmers are used as an example of patience. And then in verse 8, he says, you also be patient. Well, how do you do that, Lord? How do you do that, James? Well, number one, the key is establish your heart. That's right up here. You set your mind that you're just going to have to be patient. That's hard to do. But you're going to have to wait. Farming is used a lot in the Bible as the Christian life. Things happen. But one of the things that is key, if a farmer is going to keep his sanity, he's just got to establish his mind that he's just got to wait and pray to God. Same way when we face the problems of life. Establish your hearts. Dig in and wait and know for the coming of the Lord is at hand. He's going to come. And He'll make things right. Well, what do the oppressed do? Well, do not fall out with one another, because the judge is at the door. You know how it is sometimes when things don't go right. And when you have a sports team, like the Razorbacks, when things don't go right, sometimes there's dissension. I hope they didn't get on the old boy that, he muffed a couple of plays yesterday. Hope they didn't get on the quarterback because he muffed a couple of snaps. One guy got overly excited, and that was a roughing penalty. But if they have a year like that, what's going to happen? There's going to be discord. You let any group, you let in this church, something put us to the test, and it seems like it's not going away. It put us to the test. We're going through the thing. And a lot of times it's easy when things happen for people to get at each other's throat, isn't it? Pressure. And it grates on you, and you do things that maybe you normally wouldn't do, and you say things that you normally wouldn't say. And so here in the midst of where he's talking about oppressing and where he's talking about what's going to happen, he tells them, do not grumble against one another. Don't take your frustrations out on one another. Don't complain about one another. Don't grumble. And we know he's talking to Christians because of that little word there, brethren. And what's going to happen? Lest you be condemned. Why? Behold, the judge is standing at the door. A lot of things that could make. Number one, it couldn't mean that he's hearing everything that you say. Have you ever been in a room thinking you were just talking to somebody and nobody around was listening, but there was somebody at the door? Behold, the judge is at the door. Number two, and probably this is what it does mean, judgment is imminent. It's coming. And don't grumble. And then finally, look to those who've gone on before. Look to those who've gone on before. He carries this thought through part of the rest of the chapter, but we want to stop tonight because he carries with it a lot of other things. And we'll talk about it just a moment next week. But in James, the 5th chapter, verses 10 through 11, he writes, and he says, number one, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. I want you to think about the prophet's role a minute, especially in the Old Testament. Prophets generally were not called upon to come to people and tell them everything's going all right. Generally, they weren't called upon to tell people, y'all's doing good, just keep it up. What were prophets called upon? They were called by God to come and to straighten people out. Jonah, you go preach to Nineveh and you warn them that if they don't repent, they're going to get what's coming to them. We studied the book of Jonah. We studied the book of Naaman, where Naaman talked about what was going to happen to Assyria. We're studying Hosea tonight, where God is writing what's going to happen to Israel, and where Amos wrote about what was going to happen to Israel. Pick your Bible up sometime and read the book of Jeremiah. They got so tired of listening to him preach, he was going to quit preaching. And then he said, I had a fire in my bones. And he preached. They threw him in a pit and he preached anyway. They put him in stocks and he preached anyway. Why? Because they spoke in the name of the Lord. Elijah, who we'll talk about next week, remember, he preached, had that great outcome on 1 Kings 18. We'll allude to that next week. And yet, he thought he was the only one left, and he ran, and he hid in the cave. And the Lord said, what are you doing here? Well, Lord, I'm the only one left, and they seek to take my life away. We don't like to suffer, but sometimes in life we are going to suffer. And I want to tell you, it bothers me sometimes that I don't suffer more than I suffer by being a Christian. If they suffered in the first century for being a Christian, why don't I suffer now? Do we blend in too much like the world? Do we do all of our preaching and pontificating inside the church building? Do we take the stands that we need to take and where we need to take them? These prophets spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. And then he says in verse 11, we count them blessed that endure. Wait a little bit longer. Then we close tonight, as he closes in verse 11, with this. You have heard of the perseverance or patience of Job. And the word needs to be perseverance, endeavoring, keep on, keeping on. And seeing the intended end by the Lord. We spent probably over a year studying the book of Job. We saw what Job went through. And yet, Job, in the end, was taken care of. And he was blessed more than he was in the beginning. Because no matter what happened, he just kept on going. And James said, you've seen the end of the story, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Folks, we're going to be oppressed sometimes in life. But what we need to do is to keep on keeping on. And remember the Lord. He's going to make things right. And the Lord is at hand. If you need to come tonight, won't you come as we stand and sing?
And be always pure and good. Would you walk with him within the narrow road? Would you have him bear your burden, carry all your load? Let him have his way with thee. His power can make you what you ought to be. His blood can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul, and you will see 'twas best for him to have his way with thee. Would you have him make you free and follow at his call? Would you know the peace that comes by giving all? Would you have him save you so that you need never fall? Let him have his way with thee. His power can make you what you ought to be. His blood can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul, and you will see 'twas best for him to have his way with thee. Would you in his kingdom find a place of constant rest? Would you prove him true each providential test? Would you in his service labor always at your best? Let him have his way with thee. His power can make you what you ought to be. His blood can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul, and you will see 'twas best for him to have his way with thee.